Are we going? Yes, it looks like we're going. So, we talked about not doing an interview, but I actually do have a question because we haven't talked about music for a long time, and I'm just curious if you want to say something to start with about any main current, um, any main current in your musical thought that's developed in the last 2 or 3 years.
Um, yeah, mostly the work has been pretty consistent going back to about 2004 or so. This work with tablature and a kind of open notation. The big shift has been with this second string quartet. So in the pieces starting in 2004, maybe even go back to 2002. Um, I was working with individual movements and mapping those movements on an instrument, and each possible kind of movement. So, for example, in a string piece, movement of the left hand up and down the fingerboard, the width of the fingers, the finger pressure, the bow position, etc., would all be notated independently on
Mm-hmm.
separate staves.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes ridiculously so. So, like 4, 5, 6 staves of information, and this most recent project that led to the second quartet was an effort to keep the same kind of control of physical movements on X, Y, and Z axes for both the left and the right hands, but to have a notational image that was a single image.
Oh, I
Um,
see.
my feeling was that the notation from, say, my first string quartet or this solo string piece from 2004, that it was actually impossible for the performer to really take in all of that visual data, and so for me it somehow undid the validity of the notation, that the performer was no longer actually interacting with the notation as notation, but rather like it's a kind of crib sheet or almost like mnemonic device for some sort of muscle memory. And in this new notation, what I tried to do is it maintains exactly the same amount of information, the same level of detail, but this new tablature system is all of that information is condensed onto a single staff that represents the length of the string and uses color and thickness of lines and gradient to specify all of the various kinds of movement and pressure and speed.
But things like, if I remember the earlier notation, things like pitch would remain unspecified. Is that
Correct.
right?
Yeah, and that's still the case.
And so, I mean, one question that maybe people would be curious about hearing what you've said is, do you know what it's going to sound like after you've done all that notation, or is that something that will happen during the rehearsal and performance process?
Yeah, I mean that's the tough question, isn't it? The answer is yes, but
Hmm.
um, Um, writing that second quartet in particular was really difficult because um, at every step of the process, I was slightly horrified that I didn't know what the hell I was doing.
Hmm.
And I've been thinking about this a lot actually, and it's it's a really substantial problem when I suppose when any composer is working with a newly developed notation system, because so much of what we do, so much of our training, is about the link between imagined sound and material and notation.
Hmm.
And what happens when one part of that is broken, as it were, like when you're inventing a notational system from scratch,
Hmm.
the connection between what's on the page and what might sound is nowhere near as reliable as if you're using a learned, more stable notational system.
I always wonder how reliable the stable notation systems actually are. I mean, to me, it almost seems like what parameter you care about. So if I look at an older string quartet, traditional classical music, and I'll get rhythm and pitch and dynamics. Okay, what if I really care about pitch? Okay,
Yeah.
what if I really care that there are, 30 or 40 different possible middle Cs, and they're going to play any of them at any time? And you could
Yeah.
say that in the register that I'm listening to, that's approximate.
Right.
That
Yeah.
in fact I write a C, but I still, again, at that level of detail, don't know what I'm going to get.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's definitely true. And this whole question of pitch in particular has been a big part of the driving force for this work that I've been doing, and it all came out of the first quartet. So what I had done, I had been working with a limited collection of hand positions, which were mapped onto the fingerboard, sliding up and down the fingerboard with my hands, basically as a template. And I took that information and I did this transcription of the resulting pitches down to like 8 tones. And so you had these quadruple stop glissandi sliding up and down the fingerboard. But in the end, that wasn't the material. The material was actually the hand positions, and I decided that it was a totally dishonest notation. That it made it look like pitch was important.
Right, like people should spend time worrying about that.
That's right. It was actually the hand positions were the carrier of musical information, and the pitch was the result of this thing, the actual musical, the musical act, the real musical material. So maybe that's the very long-winded answer to the question, that the things that this new notation includes, that are most important to me, are the things that are more predictable for me in the composition process. So those are the things that I can hear and I can imagine. So those are much clumsier, less refined aspects of gesture, real sort of speeds and densities and pressures, and those are reasonably repeatable, even if the kind of micro level detail is different every time. I don't know. It's the equivalent of your middle C example, that that notation specifies a particular kind of movement. That movement is repeatable in the way that the C is repeatable, even though there are going to be micro level adjustments to that result.
Now, have you had experience with different groups doing this kind of notation, and do you get wildly different results, or?
Well, the second quartet has only been done twice now, both by the Jack Quartet. And let's see, the first quartet has been done by 4 different groups, but also under dramatically different performance situations. It's hard to evaluate. No, the results aren't wildly different. They're definitely different, but I'm not sure they're any more different than any notational material would be in different hands.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was talking, I guess it was last summer, to Peter Oblinger, or we've had kind of an ongoing conversation about the word experimental music.
Yeah.
And even though I certainly don't have any trouble thinking of him as an experimental composer from the U.S. standpoint, not unrelated to things that Alvin Lucier or Christian Wolff or James Tenney or others have been interested in, he rejects the term in the European context. Yeah, because he thinks that, well, at least within the German-speaking world, if you're called an experimental experimental composer, it's a way of saying you're not really a composer. That you don't, that you don't really know the outcome, and therefore, in a way, you don't know what you're doing. And so, he doesn't have any. He says, if I want to call him an experimental composer, I have to always append in the American tradition And as we're talking about notation, I guess that's kind of what I was curious about is that a dangerous word for you as well? I mean, do you see
No,
yourself as having any relationship to that, or?
yeah, absolutely. But it's something that um, I'm struggling with a bit, and recently in particular. That I used to even like in biographical statements, I would say that I'm an experimental composer, and a German colleague of mine made fun of me for that, and I took it out. Um, so that makes more sense now. Um, no, and I think the work definitely comes from it really does come out of that tradition. The way I think about material, the way I think about the compositional process, I think owes a lot to the American experimental tradition. The thing that's been difficult though for me, um, that's a bizarre thing to, and I suppose maybe excessively candid. Um, the we have this. I've been struggling with issues of invention and originality and how that connects to the idea of experimentation and how far away from the event we have to be before we can evaluate the results of that experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, how many performances, how many years, how many different performers would have to play a piece like this before I could say that I've had enough input to be able to then work that knowledge back into the compositional process for a new piece.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds really stupid and again like excessively candid and self-aware, but yeah, we have this idea, I think, of I don't know, like avant-garde composers, right? Being so the idea of being sort of ahead of your time,
Mm-hmm.
ahead of your listeners.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's true in the visual arts and film, whatever. The idea of being an experimental artist, that's kind of the idea. But I think that starts with the premise that, or at least an assumption, that artist knows what they're doing, as you said. That they're the ones who know what the results are supposed to be, and it's the audience who's waiting to catch up.
Mm-hmm.
I'm coming to think that maybe that's not true. That actually, if you're doing it right, you're going in just as blindly. That's actually for me what sort of defines the idea of being an experimental composer. That I'm interested in the questions, setting out my sort of scenario for asking those questions. But then I'm actually legitimately interested in the results rather than the piece being my answer to those questions.
Mm-hmm.
But the piece actually is the question. And for me, I mean, that's something that connects very much to your work, because the kinds of things that some of your certainly your older pieces that deal with extended durations or silences or that kind of threshold, that only exists through experience. You're setting up some experiential phenomenon. And so it isn't a question where you know what it's going to be like.
No, I mean yeah. I mean, I'm completely comfortable with that question. That whether if somebody asks me, do I know how this thing is going to sound? Having the answer fall all over the map. So, I mean, for me, in one piece, the answer might be completely no. I have no idea. There isn't enough specified in the score. For instance, number of players could be totally open. And so if somebody says about an unrhymed chord, do I know how it's going to sound? The answer has to be no. If you have 72 people playing it, it will sound different than if you have 4 people playing it. That much I could know, but before any performance is set up, I have no idea what the piece sounds like. And I think it's also possible to answer completely the opposite, to say, well, this piece was made by me on my computer out of samples. I know exactly how it sounds.
Yeah, of course.
But I think that the larger question or thing you're talking about could be true in either case. You could make an object that in a way seems complete, but that the experience when other people hear it will be still a mystery to you, or in a performance space or something.
Yeah. I find it really interesting, and the fact that there's the the evaluative question is whether or not you know what you're doing. That really is something that I struggle with, because there's a part of me that wants to set out to write a really great piece, but I hate good music. Like, I'm not really interested in that as a listener, or but then um, but then it's difficult when a piece um, when a piece is challenging for me to, a piece of mine is challenging for me to get my head around.
Mm-hmm.
At what point do I decide that it's a crap piece, or and there's something that I need to rework, or is it that my brain and my ears haven't caught up yet? Ublinger's work for me is very much like that. The first time I heard his work, I hated it, and I love it. I mean, I absolutely love it. It just took it took time and some effort. And so I wonder if that's true for Peter. Like does he have that experience where he walks away from a piece thinking, I don't know.
Yeah, I think we all kind of know that experience of making something that we're not sure if we like, only to find out 10 years later that we actually do like it. That it took us that amount of time to learn what it was we were doing. Yeah, I think that's familiar. Okay, well, I'm going to end the recording now, but we can keep talking.
Excellent. Okay.